Okay. Hey, everybody. Um, those of you who know me, I don't need to introduce myself. My name is Dr. Root. There may be some people in Dr. Wong's 398 class who don't know me or haven't had me as a teacher. So I am Dr. Root. Dr. Wong's asked me to do a little bit of, I don't know that I would call it a lecture, but she wants me to talk a little bit about how um, I went about doing the research and I guess doing the work and everything else that was necessary in writing my book that's going to be being published. Well, it originally was set to be published in June. Um, I don't know if the whole coronavirus thing is going to push that back any. I know that the publisher has been closed for a while. I think they're supposed to be closed up until like the end of the first week of April or something. And pardon me, they're in the middle of formatting and typesetting my book and stuff. So it may be pushed back a little bit, but regardless, I mean, the book is, underway. So, um, having never taught a 398 class, I don't really know exactly what you guys cover in there. Um, I asked Dr. Wong um, some very minimalist type of questions about what maybe I could address in here that would be of any kind of assistance to you guys, or what what something I've done that may overlap with what you all have been shown, or what you all have been doing. So if you see me glancing over to my right, it's because I have my other laptop open over there, and it's got Dr. Wong's sort of bullet points, things that I can hit on. Um, First things first, I guess I should talk about um, the the book itself, and kind of how I came up with the idea for it. Um, the book itself, actually, what's funny is I can't actually recall what the new title of the book is. Originally, the title of it that I had, and it's very close to this, but the publisher changed it slightly. The original title of it was something like "To Please God or to Not Please God: The Puritan Question." Um, Puritan vernacular in or something like um, the vernacular of Puritan literature in from the 16th to the 18th century, or something like that. Again, like I said, it went through so many permutations. I don't remember exactly what the title is off the top of my head, but it's something along those lines. Um, let me do something with my light really quickly here. Sorry, the light the way it was blinding me. So um, to I guess also as sort of a beginning point to kind of explain um, how I came up with that topic. Um, Actually, the topic itself was probably about 10 years in the making. When I was a grad student, when I was at the University of Georgia, I would say it was probably, I'm going to say, I'm going to take a guess. I'm going to say 2006. For I was probably reading a larger number of them in a shorter amount of time than I had throughout my entire college career. And what I started noticing was that a lot of the early American literature that I was reading, excuse me, the vernacular in it was really similar to a lot of the books that I had read in my field of expertise, which was 18th century British literature. And what I started trying to do at that time was kind of put together a matrix kind of in my head about certain phrases I noticed that these authors all used that seemed to be being used commonly used, but not always used in the same way. So, like, for example, that was how I came up with the title "To Please God." Well, one of the phrases that all of the writers I looked at in my book use was "it pleased God," or "it pleases God," or "if it pleases God." And again, I made like a matrix in the book that has all the variants and things on it. And so what I realized was that throughout my sort of trying to make these connections with just the language, I kind of came to a conclusion that these writers were all either Puritans or they were raised in Puritan households, or they were well sort of connected or acquainted with Puritan communities, etc. So essentially, where I'm going is these guys were all could all be considered Puritan writers. And I remember at the time, again, probably probably 10, 12 years ago, I started working on a paper, and or I started working on. Again, this is just letting you guys know, especially those of you who are going to go on to grad school, you're going to get rejected. You just are. It's part of our game. It's part of the business. But at that point in time, the thing you have to remember is I was busy with a lot of other stuff. I was working on my dissertation. I had met my wife, maybe like a year, two before that. So I was, just starting to get into a committed relationship. I had a lot of other things going on that kept me from doing much more with it. Once I got rejected for the conference, I guess I kind of felt like, well, maybe the idea just isn't good enough, and I put it on the back burner. And so it was something that had been marinating for me for a long time. It's just that I didn't really have the time. And honestly, one other thing too that again, you guys who go on are going to find out is I probably also didn't have the ability then either to pull off anything extensive, like a book, or maybe, to be honest, maybe even like a presentation length paper. And this is one of the reasons why those of you who have taken my class, when I have you do assignments for me, a lot of times what I will tell you is, if you commit yourself to doing an assignment, and you legitimately work hard on it, what may start out in my class as being a 5 to 7 page paper, if you really do your due diligence on it and you work on it, you might come back to it 2 or 3 years later and add a couple pages to it, turn it into a conference paper. And then the next thing you know, bam, you go give a conference presentation, and somebody who happens to be at that conference comes to you and says, hey, this is really interesting. Have you thought about doing anything more with it? And whether you have or whether you haven't, you can always tell them, yeah, sure. And, go from there. So that's why I always tell my students, don't like you're just writing a paper to get through that class. The way I think you want to look at assignments is, I never know if down the road I can use this. So let me keep it in my back pocket, because maybe at some point in time I can come back to this and I can do more with it. Lanisha Boyd, I think, is a great example of somebody who I taught that I have seen doing that. She did a presentation in probably I'm going to say maybe January, about she had a paper on the sort of like the mammy stereotype. I'm not saying that she started with that idea in my class, because I don't know when she started with it, but I know that when I was teaching her world lit, me and her worked together on that paper, and I at least initially helped her get through some of the ideas that ended up in the presentation paper that she gave when I watched her present. And again, this is one of those things where for her, if she continues on that path, that's something that can turn into a book chapter, a journal article, and from there, the possibilities are become more extensive. I mean, it could turn into a whole book. So again, my point is I think a lot of times what people and it's not just English students think is, all I need is to get this done to get through this class. And I think that sometimes that's short-sighted. You're not thinking about, down the road, maybe this would come in handy too. So that would be one piece of advice I would give people is, don't treat your writing like it's in a vacuum. Don't treat it like you're just writing for the moment. Think about how you might be able to use something like that down the road, because that's what happened to me. And that's kind of what I'm building to here. I'm kind of trying to give you a narrative about what happened with me. I'm not trying to tell you my story is the typical one, but I'm proof that it can happen. So fast forward, probably like I was at Claflin. Fast forward probably 8 years. I think it was 2016. I went to a conference in Jacksonville, and I was presenting on Thoreau. And Thoreau, again, was early American lit. And not something that is my background. Like, again, you guys who've had me as a teacher know I teach British lit. Not something that really is my background. But I always liked Thoreau. I had read a lot of Thoreau in grad school. And again, I'd had this idea kind of marinating in my mind about Walden being a utopia, and writing about sort of how Thoreau's utopia had rules that, I'm trying to think of how to make this succinct. Because I guess it's not that major of a point to make. But basically, because Thoreau was supposed to be alone in Walden, he could basically almost make rules that would maintain the purity or the insularity of his utopia, because he was supposed to be the only one who was out there in Walden. And so he could make rules basically that, that as he saw fit, to either keep people from becoming a part of his society, or he could let them in as he saw fit. Okay. So again, kind of a side point. So I gave this presentation. I really didn't think that much of it because I had submitted that as a chapter to a journal about utopias, and I got rejected. The chapter got rejected, and the main reason that it got rejected was because, pardon me, was because I'm not a utopian scholar, and I'm not a Thoreau scholar, and I'm not an early American lit scholar. And so one of the things, again, that Dr. Wong has probably tried to stress to you guys is one of the major things that any publisher is going to ask you, and usually this is one of the hardest questions to answer, I have always found, is what they're going to ask you is, what contribution does your work make to the field of study on your subject? And the reason that was tough for me was because I'm not a utopian scholar. As I said, I'm not a Thoreau scholar, and I'm not even an early American lit scholar. Now, I'm more of one now, okay, but I wasn't then. So basically, when I got rejected from the journal, that was what they told me, was that really it didn't bring anything to the current landscape of what was being looked at with Thoreau. Okay, so again, I had that chapter and thought, well, there was this conference about utopia and dystopia. Let me go present this paper. I already had one in the can. You know, Claflin gave me travel money. My wife's brother lived in Jacksonville. I knew that, you know, we would have a place to stay if we went there, and Claflin didn't have the money to get me a hotel, or if they weren't going to give me enough funds. So I knew that, you know, we could go there. And I knew that, you know, she wouldn't mind seeing her brother because they didn't get to see each other. So I figured I'd go ahead and apply. So, okay, I go to Jacksonville. I present this paper. When I get done presenting, a young woman came up and approached me and asked me if I had ever thought about writing a book on that topic. My initial thought was to tell her no, because I really hadn't, you know, I didn't have anything. I didn't, you know, again, it wasn't like Thoreau was someone I had written a dissertation on and that was part of it. You understand what I mean? Like, it wasn't like I had taken a chapter out of something longer I had written and gone and presented it at a conference like that. All I had was what I had there. It was a little longer. The original chapter I had written, it might have been like, I'm going to pull out a number here. It might have been 30 to 40 pages. And the one I presented at the conference was probably like 12 to 15, something like that. So, I mean, you know, it's what I mean. It was, it's not like I had this big voluminous, like, stack of, sorry, I'm trying to get my hands in here. This big voluminous stack of Thoreau stuff to go back and dig through if I wanted to write a book. And initially I was going to tell her, you know, no, I never thought about writing a book on this because I don't know enough about it, which would have been the honest answer. But I told her, you know, yeah, particularly with the idea of utopias, I thought about dabbling in that. Okay, so she asked me to come meet with her later in that day because she represented a press. She represented Lexington Books, which is a subsidiary of Rowan and Littlefield. Dr. Wong has also worked with them. Okay, so they're a pretty reputable press. Well, I went and met with her, And what she basically did was she gave me like I don't want to call it stack, but like a almost like a pamphlet, like almost like a little leaflet that I had to complete. And I had to write something on there, like, I had to write, obviously, I had to tell them who I was. And then I had to write, let me back up a step. She asked me if I would be interested in writing a book for them about Thoreau and about utopias. And I said, fine, because to be honest with you, that it doesn't happen that often that a writer gets, especially somebody who was 36. Pardon me. It doesn't happen that often that you get solicited by a publisher. Usually, you have to send out manuscripts and stuff. So I figured, well, if they're going to solicit me, I'll at least go listen to her, and I'll at least fill this thing out. And the worst thing they can do is reject me, because, like I had already told you guys several times, once you start getting rejected, it doesn't sting as badly. It's like getting criticism from me. If you've ever had me as a teacher in your papers, the first time you get that criticism, I'm sure a lot of you think, I'm worse than Hitler. But by the time I think most of you are done dealing with me, you understand that that's just how I am, and I'm trying to help you get better. It's nothing personal. It'd be much easier for me to just slap an A on your paper and go on about my life, but it doesn't help you any, and I'm not doing my job. And at the end of the day, if I'm not doing my job, I don't feel right about myself. That's just me. So my point is I had already been rejected, several times, and look at my face. It's not as if I'd never been rejected by a woman before or anything. So again, it's not like I wasn't used to being rejected. So my point was the way I looked at it was, the worst I can do is fill this thing out, send it into them, and they go, okay, we don't really like it. Okay, it was going to take me a couple days to do the thing. Big deal. So I fill, I do all the stuff. I write a prospectus. For those of you, Dr. Wong, I'm sure has probably gone over with you what a prospectus is. I wrote the rationale for it. I did my best to explain how I thought it would help further the field of study, which was a little bit of, admittedly, I probably shouldn't tell you this, a little bit of a BS answer, just because I really didn't know that much about the field of study. And so, anyway, a couple weeks later, they wrote me back, and they sent me a contract. And so I started work on a book, and the book was basically about I tried to write it about the history of American utopias. And the first manuscript I wrote, it was pretty long. It was probably like, I'm going to say 280 pages. And they wrote back to me, and basically they told me they didn't like it. The premise wasn't clear. And basically what my premise was, just to explain, was the idea that that originally almost every utopian community in America was basically founded around the idea of God being the center of it, and that every one of those utopias crumbled because by the time each one of these cities had been in existence for about a generation, the focus changed. So that was basically what my premise was. Well, sorry, I'm getting warm. I don't know if maybe, and you also never know who's reading your book either. And I'm not sure because to me, here's the thing. I thought the premise was pretty clear. I I don't know if maybe it was maybe they viewed the premise as being kind of conservative, and that they didn't, whoever was reading it didn't like that. I don't know if maybe, the premise just itself wasn't very, again, related to anything that was a current issue within utopian studies. Because again, I'll say this one more time, I don't study utopias, so I would have had to go and become an expert on utopias to really start writing the book. And I knew I just needed to start writing it. So before I ever became a knowledge box of utopian studies, I just went ahead and wrote the book. Then they sent it back to me, and the problem was that and again, I'm only telling you all this not to beat my gums, but to sort of illustrate to you things you may experience. They sent it back to me, and the feedback really wasn't very helpful. Like whoever read the book, I don't know if they assumed that I was already like an expert on utopian studies, or if they I actually maybe thought that they actually didn't read the book, what I had written, very closely, because again, I felt like some of the things that they said were not like consistent, and I'm pretty hard on my own work. I felt like they were. So I went back to the drawing board again, and I had some major doubts about the second draft I handed in, because it ended up being longer. And I actually added like 50 pages of new material to it. So the second draft I handed in, it was about 325 pages, something like that. And the second person who gave me feedback also told me that, the premise didn't really work, but their comments were more helpful. And it gave me a little bit better idea of what direction to go in. And Dr. Wong, if you're watching this, I will get to these questions, but I think this is important to kind of build up to explaining this stuff. So, when I got the second manuscript back, the comments were actually more helpful. And that was when I started kind of realizing, like, maybe I need to either change the premise, or maybe what I need to do actually altogether is just change the topic. And I told myself I was going to give it one more try under the present topic. And then if they rejected it again, I was either going to tell them that I wasn't going to continue work on it, or I was going to ask them if I could change my subject. Because what happened was, as I was writing, I was noticing that a lot of the themes that I was using were dealing with, like, the Puritans. And I had still had that idea in my back pocket from all those years before about the Puritan vernacular. And now I had read so much more stuff, I felt like I could actually take that idea and make it more bona fide than I could, 10 or 11 years earlier, when I hadn't, I'd only read like two works, and I was trying to make a paper say, I was trying to base a whole, an entire premise on one or two books that I had read. But what happened was, so I got the third, I was working on revising it the third time, and my dad got very sick and ended up in the hospital. and went into a medical induced coma at the end of 2017. And he was in a coma for, probably about 2 weeks. And I had been working and progressing on the book, and admittedly, it was really, that happening was really hard on me. Both my parents are still alive. I never knew my grandparents. So what I'm getting at is, like, I've never had a family member other than my beagle. You guys, if you've ever heard me talk about my beagle, he's the closest thing probably to like a family member that I've ever experienced the loss of. And so that was really hard on me. And it took me a long time to where I could start getting my mind back into writing. Because, life continues to happen. I mean, things continue to happen. I mean, lots of stuff happened to me during the time of working on this book. I mean, I had probably more than one kidney stone, and it's very hard to do work when you're in pain. My wife was in a car accident where she really could have been killed. She's still injured from it. What I'm getting at is there's always going to be obstacles in your way of doing stuff. And so, just to back the train up, I finally got around to working on that second, or I guess, was it the second, or it must have been my third submission to them, after my dad got better, and they rejected me a third time and told me that, the writing was good, but that, it was too long, and that the premise just wasn't, the premise just didn't hold up over the length of the work. And that was when I more started looking at it, I think more objectively, and realizing that they were right. I was just in over my head. So I reached out to the book rep, the woman who originally made me the offer, and I asked her if it would be permissible for me to make a change. And she told me that I would have to go through the whole process of writing the, all that original stuff again, like the prospectus and all those things. And I just thought, well, again, what's the worst that can happen? I have this idea here. If they reject it, they reject it. But if they don't, then, I think I can actually run with this idea. Because it was one that I had been marinating on it for a decade. So I rewrote my prospectus, sent it back to them, and they accepted it. Okay. And then off to the races. So now that you have the backstory of what happened, one of the things Dr. Wong talked about was, okay, well, my training and interests. Well, one of the things about my background training as far as, research goes. First thing first, when I was in grad school and I first really started having to do a lot of research, I always envisioned myself being more of like a teacher and less of a researcher. And then what happened was, when I started writing my dissertation, I liked the research so much that I almost felt like, man, I'm better at this than I am teaching. And I almost wanted to just, be like a researcher. My background in research is I'm very classically trained. My major advisor, I was the last, he retired with me. I was the last person he worked with. before he retired. And he was at the University of Georgia. He got, let's put it this way. He started at the University of Georgia the year I was born. And so in 2010, when I got my doctorate, he had been there 30 years. And I was the last person that he worked with. So I was very classically trained because the person I worked with who trained me was old school. So my training, you know, like you guys today, and it makes me sound like an old man or something, you know, you guys today, even though Claflin, admittedly, you know, the library is small, you know, and it probably is lacking in a lot of ways. You guys have, you know, electronic databases there where like you never have to leave your dorm room if you want to find, you know, at least most of their databases. I know sometimes they let the subscriptions lapse. I know that happens sometimes, but for the most part, I mean, you guys can look at databases whenever you want. And, you know, as long as you know how to perform simple searches, you can find articles on things that you need to find articles on without, you know, you can sit in your bed on a laptop and do that. I couldn't do that. I was at the University of Georgia, and man, the University of Georgia, it's a big school, and the library there, it's huge. I mean, it's huge. Like it's the size of probably. I mean, I'm just trying to give you a scale, a perspective. I mean, I would say the library there is probably as big as if you took just about every building on Claflin's campus and put them all together. That the library at UGA is probably that big. I mean, the library there is just it's enormous. And so a lot of my training involved the idea that what I was taught was there are seminal, meaning like important works that, pardon me, are fundamental in doing research and studies on whatever it is you're doing your research and studies on. What that means is, again, like, for example, Dr. Wong, I'm sure, has taught you guys about like what it means to do a literature review. Well, you know, before you do any major work, you pretty well have to do a literature review. Because you have to know what's being said and what's been said about what it is that you're studying, and you have to know what the major works are involving that particular person or that particular topic. Because again, if you don't know it, one, it leaves gaping holes in your research. The other one is that you have to build your knowledge base around what the important critics, be it contemporary ones or be it the critics that are primary, like the ones that were alive while whoever or whatever you're writing about was going on. You have to find those things out. You can't just, again, here's my point. As far as doing research, databases are great, but most of them are only going to go back so far or go up so far. You know, like they're not going to go up to 2020 right now. And most of the journals you find online stuff, they're not going to go back, you know, much further than probably I'll pull a guess out, the 60s, maybe, depending on the journal. My point is you probably aren't going to find everything that you need online. So you need to learn how to go to the libraries and actually go through the stacks, go find the books you need. You know, these are things you have to learn to do. Is it a pain to have to go do that? Yeah. And let me tell you something. It was a real pain at UGA to have to go get all those books and then to have to haul them back from the library to my office and have all those books stacked up in my office and have to either bring them home as I needed them or read them there. Again, there was a point in time where in my apartment, my whole floor underneath my desk, it was stacked up probably like knee high, all underneath my entire desk with books. Because literally when I was writing my dissertation, I probably consulted, and I'm just talking about books. I'm not talking about articles. I'm not talking about stuff online. Hundreds of books. And I read, and here's another, again, a piece of advice for you. You're going to read thousands of pages of material you're never going to use. And brace yourself for that right now. Again, that's the reality of it. You are going to read thousands of pages of stuff that you will never see the light of day in anything you write. Just be ready to accept that. My research interests primarily before this book, and some of it is in this book. 18th century British lit was my expertise. Samuel Johnson was the writer that I wrote my dissertation on. There was a point in time where, and not now, but there was a point in time where I probably could have given you out of my head a bibliography of probably the 25 or 30 most important works on Johnson, and given you a summary of what they were about just out of my head. I couldn't do that now, but when I was really involved in the work, I probably could have. Again, I've explained to you all the process of choosing the topic for the book. Really, it was something I had been mulling over for a long time. It was just nothing I had really followed up on until I decided, it kind of happened in a roundabout way. While I was doing the research for the original book and writing for the original book they wanted me to write, it just so happened that a lot of the stuff I was coming across was stuff that I felt like would have worked with that original idea I had about the Puritans and the way they spoke. So it kind of was a very propitious is a good word, a very fortunate sort of thing, a happy accident. But it wasn't, again, I don't want you to think it was one of those things where I woke up and it was an epiphany. It was, I had been thinking of that idea about the Puritans and the way they spoke and wrote for 10 years. I just never really had the wherewithal to follow up on it until I was in a situation where I had this book contract and I had to write this book. But the book I was writing for them, clearly they weren't liking what I was writing, and I was getting tired of writing for no reason. Because and here's another thing about the process of it. It's going to be published, assuming again the coronavirus thing doesn't hamper it too much, June 2020. I started writing this thing in like early, probably early 2017. So, I mean, that tells you like from the time I started writing till the time this book is going to be published. I mean, that's 3.5 years. Now, granted, it didn't take me 3.5 years to write the book that's being published. That probably took me more like, I'm going to pull out a number here. That probably took me, I'm going to say maybe 6 to 9 months to write the one that they're going to publish. But what I mean is from start to stopping point, I mean, 3.5 years, that's a long time. I mean, that's a long time. And again, multiple rejections, guys. This is the way it is. John Milton, they said, was a guy who when he touched his pen to paper, God spoke through his pen. Well, most of us aren't John Milton. I'm not. I mean, I'm proof of that. John Milton, who knows what he could have written in 3.5 years, but I'm not John Milton. I don't claim to be John Milton. I'm never going to be John Milton. My point is, I'm going to look over here at the questions real quick. I think I've actually answered most of the questions that Dr. Wong kind of had me kind of wanted me to tackle. I didn't want this lecture to be more than about a class period, because I was pretty sure maybe that's how she was going to use it. Was kind of like to cover a class period for you guys. And I think I can wrap it up in about 5 minutes. She asked me to discuss the vetting process for a book contract. As far as their vetting process for the contract, one thing they definitely want to make sure of is that you are at least somebody who has credibility within your discipline. What that means is, for instance, you guys watching this are undergrads. Even if you're a very good writer, you shouldn't think that as an undergrad you're going to get a book contract. Okay, I mean, I'm just telling you that now because they're looking for people who are credible and at least somewhat established in their discipline. And what that usually means, if you're going to write an academic book, is they want you to have a doctorate. They want you to be somebody who's proven that they can do the work and handle the load. As far as what they do to make sure the manuscript is viable, obviously, you guys have probably also heard the term brain fart. They're blindly reviewed. Like, they're peer reviewed, but they're blindly reviewed. What that means is, my name isn't on the manuscript anywhere. And what they typically do is they ask, at least with me, what they did, they asked me to give them the names of five people that I felt like were experts in the topic that I wrote on. And what they do is they contact those people and ask them, will you read this manuscript anonymously and then give us your feedback on it? And because it's blindly reviewed, they don't know me. I mean, it could be somebody who taught me, but they wouldn't know it was me. They wouldn't know it was my book. But I didn't give them the names of, when I gave them names, I didn't give them the names of anybody I was acquainted with. But probably my guess would be based on what their reader tells them. I would, again, I'm just kind of going on what my impression was. If a reader reads it and maybe has like a lukewarm sort of response to it, they probably send it to another reader, and then they try to get a consensus on it. I think what happened with mine was, by the time I got it actually done, and handed in, and I was confident in it, the person who read the very first one I handed in said that with a few things done to it, it was strong enough to go off to be pressed. So they took that person's word and they said, go back, make these changes, and we're happy with it. Um, the other thing that the thing I will end with, Dr. Wong said it's for me to explain kind of the original contributions of this book. Well, the thing about this book that I think honestly made it marketable in the end is it's very interdisciplinary. Anyone who's had me as a teacher, you guys know, and I've told you again, my background training is it's not only was I more classically trained in how to research and things, but my background is literature. And that's why, again, like, I'm not going to be a preliminary choice at Claflin to teach like literary theory. That's not my strong suit. It's just not. Now, don't get me wrong. My professionalism and my own confidence in my abilities, I could probably teach it, but I don't think I'd be anybody in the English department's first choice to teach it. You know, like African American lit. I know I could teach African American lit, but I know there are people in the department who know way more about it than me. So I wouldn't be the first choice to teach it. Well, something like Brit lit, you know, I'm probably at least up there as being one of the first choices at Claflin to teach it because that's my background. That's what I studied. And where I'm going with this is that you all know that basically my background is literature. Well, I think the thing that made this book appealing was it actually, and actually the reader made this comment on it. This book is probably not something that could be used as a textbook in a class. It could be used as a supplement in a class depending on the subject being taught. But what this book would be excellent for is resource material that could be shelved in a library and provide, you know, a multitude of perspectives on the topic at hand. And here's what I took that to mean. There's a lot of history in my book. People who have taken my classes know I focus on the history. I think history is extremely important. That's another thing I probably should have mentioned earlier. I think if you don't know a historical period that you are writing about or that you're studying, you may as well not even waste your time. Because if you don't understand the historical period, you're not going to understand the stuff that was being written about and what it means. It also, I think, in a lot of ways, it can almost be considered a theological book because it has a lot to do with the scripture and the way the Puritans interpreted the scripture and sort of my more contemporary take on that as more of a what's the word? Probably like somebody who's Christian, but not necessarily like a fundamentalist in any particular way I view it. Whereas the Puritans were very fundamentalist, which means that it was kind of easy for me to look at what they were doing and say, yeah, this was kind of a, you know, hasty maybe on their part. I also think it could be a sociological book. Again, the thing I think makes my book strong was that I came at it with a multidisciplinary approach. And I think that multidisciplinary approach probably helped me end up having the book be given the go-ahead by the reader and by the publisher as much as anything else, because I think that me trying to sell that book on the strength of one, sort of discipline or one sort of focus, I think would have been to take away. And also, let me add one more thing too. I think it also has a linguistic appeal because it deals with the language too. I think for me to emphasize it as being only one discipline would have been to sell it short for all the other things that it does too. So at the end of the day, when I went to kind of describe the book to them and market it, which is what they tell you to do after you write the book, I basically told them, that I didn't think it was a textbook. I didn't write it to try to make it a textbook. I think it's something where if someone was teaching a course and the course had a lot to do with the settling of America or the establishing of various sort of mores and principles and practices in America, particularly religious ones, that the book could be used as a supplemental text. But for the most part, I think the person who read it was spot on when they said it's a resource book. And, I'm happy with that. I think at the end of the day, and this is kind of where I'll wrap up, I think at the end of the day, I try not to be monochromatic in what I do. I try to look at things from a lot of different angles. And I think that me looking at what I think me looking at the topic that I did through the lenses that I did, not only does it help make the book more well-rounded, but I think that it also kept me from projecting maybe my own politics. And I don't mean that like in a sense of like Republican or Democrat. What I mean by politics is like, I think it kept me from interjecting a lot of myself into the book because that's not what I wanted. I didn't want to do that. At the end of the day, my hope is that the book sees the light of day, which it's supposed to. I hope it's received decently. I mean, I'm sure there are people who are going to read it and like anything else, will hatchet job it to death. That's just stuff you have to learn to expect. And maybe that's probably the best place for me to wrap up is, just the idea that any of you guys who are thinking of going into doing this for a career, now is the time to embrace what and I'm only speaking for people that I know who share my philosophy. But right now is where you want to embrace what the Nick Robinsons, the Nikki Proctor Waldens, the Dr. Roots. This is the time you want to embrace what we're doing, because what we're trying to do is prepare you for what you're going to encounter when you get out there, whether it's in grad school or whether it's trying to write a book. We're not trying to beat you up. A lot of times I think students think that we're not trying to beat you up. That's not, at least that's not my goal. And I don't think any of my colleagues, any of them, I don't think any of us set out to do that. But it's tough out there. And if you can learn to take criticism and moreover use it to improve what you're doing now, it's only going to help you when you get out into grad school and out into the world of actually trying to write a book or be published or do whatever it is that you're going to do. Because someone once said, everyone's a critic. And that's the truth. And the more you put yourself out there, the more you're going to see that. And you're just going to have to accept that sometimes, you know, you're going to have to, I don't want to use that phrase. My dad used to use it, and I don't want to be profane. You have to learn to take a lot of crap. If you're going to try to do things the way that you want to do them, or you're going to have to learn to be flexible enough to do things the way that your bosses or whoever you're working for want you to do them, so that you can get done what you need to get done, so that you can move on to the next level. It's just like passing a class. You know, sometimes you just have to do what you have to do to get it done. And at the end of the day, that's probably the best advice I could give to you guys. So I hope that helped. Again, you know, as far as me getting into the specifics of my research, I feel like that would be just painstaking for me to sit there and describe that stuff to you. So I just kind of tried to give you an overview of how I do it. One other thing I will say that I do a lot of is bibliographies. If I find a book that's extremely helpful, or some source that's extremely helpful, I go to the bibliography of that book and I look at what that person was looking at. And then I go find those sources myself and I read and I dig those up. That's one of the that's why bibliographies actually are there, really. That yes, they're there because you have to attribute your sources, as you all know, as English majors. But another reason they're there is for further info, so that if you're reading and you're interested, you can get more information on a topic if you need it. That's really what a bibliography is there for. Okay, so that's where I'd wrap up. Dr. Wong, thank you for giving me the opportunity to do this. I hope it helped. I hope it was something along the lines of what you wanted your students to get from it. And as far as you guys who were listening, I tried to keep it to about an hour. I hope it helps. And again, any of you, if you ever have a question about something I've said here or anything else, and you see me around, especially my former students who already know me, and you just want to bend my ear about something, you know, you can just email me or come by well, I guess you can't come by my office now, but assuming that, you know, we end up being able to go back out in the world at some point, you know, you can always come by my office and ask me a question, and I'm more than an open book. So on that note, thank you all. And I hope it helped you in some way.